Greetings, dear viewers. Today, we embark on a captivating journey through the mists of time, into the very heart of ancient Greece, to take a close look at the life and deeds of one of the most brilliant, controversial, and undoubtedly pivotal figures in ancient history. We speak of a man whose astonishing foresight and indomitable will saved not only his native Athens, but arguably all of Hellenic civilization from being consumed by a mighty Eastern despotism. We speak of a man whose sophisticated cunning and unparalleled political genius evoked both fervent admiration from some and burning hatred from others. We speak of a man who became the true architect of Athens's naval power, laying the foundation for its future greatness, yet who, by a twist of fate, ended his days in the service of his homeland's sworn enemy. His name resounded throughout Hellas, and to this day, it sparks debate among historians. This is Themistocles. The story of Themistocles is not merely a dry chronicle of an outstanding strategist and astute politician's biography. It is a true ancient drama, filled with dizzying heights and crushing falls. It is a story of selfless devotion to the ideals of the polis and of bitter betrayal, which can come even from those whom you served faithfully. It is a tale of incredible, almost mystical intuition that allowed him to foresee coming storms, and of the tragic fate that often befalls those who dare to be ahead of their time. This is a profound narrative of how one man, not belonging to the narrow circle of hereditary aristocracy, was able to radically change the course of history, relying solely on the strength of his sharp mind, unyielding will, and rare gift of persuasion, capable of swaying both individuals and entire popular assemblies. Let us together delve into this amazing, turbulent era of the rise of Athenian democracy and naval supremacy, and attempt to impartially understand who Themistocles truly was: a selfless savior of his fatherland or a cold, calculating opportunist, skillfully playing on the passions and ambitions of his fellow citizens. To fully comprehend the magnitude of Themistocles' personality and the significance of his actions, we must first envision the Athens of his time. Let us mentally transport ourselves to the turn of the 6th and 5th centuries BCE. Athens of this period was a bubbling, seething cauldron of political passions, social transformations, and philosophical inquiries. Only recently, thanks to the bold and far-reaching reforms first of the wise Solon, who laid the foundations of civil society and abolished debt slavery, and then, after the tyranny of the Pisistratids, thanks to the decisive transformations of Cleisthenes, who definitively dismantled tribal structures and created a new system of territorial phylae, tribes, democracy had been established here. It was still very young, not yet strong enough to put down deep roots, but it had already granted ordinary Athenian citizens, the demos, an unprecedented right to vote, the right to actively participate in the governance of their native polis through the popular assembly, the Council of 500, and the jury courts, the Heliaea. The social structure of Athens was complex. At the top were the Eupatridae, the ancient landowning nobility possessing wealth and influence, followed by the Geomoroi, small and medium landowners, who formed the backbone of the hoplite militia. Then the Demi-orgoi, craftsmen and merchants, whose importance grew with the development of the Athenian economy. And finally, the Thetes, the poorest citizens, laborers, and day workers, who had little political weight before Cleisthenes' reforms. However, the old landed aristocracy, the Eupatridae, whose power had seemed unshakable for centuries, had no intention of easily relinquishing their privileged positions. A fierce, sometimes hidden, sometimes open struggle between the demos, the people in a broad sense, and the aristocratic clans, between ardent supporters of the old oligarchic order and fervent adherents of new democratic freedoms, was the main driving force of all Athenian political life. determining its intensity and unpredictability. Athens was also becoming a cultural center. Theater was emerging. The great tragedians Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides were only just preparing to reveal their masterpieces to the world. But hymns and dithyrambs already resounded, pre-Socratic. Philosophers sought the fundamental principles of existence, and poets celebrated valor and beauty. It was in such a complex, dynamic, and contradiction-filled atmosphere, around 524 BCE, that our hero was born. Themistocles could not boast of the impeccable aristocratic lineage that opened many doors in Athenian society at the time. His father, Neocles, though belonging to the fairly distinguished but not most influential or wealthy Lycomid clan, was not among those who shaped the destiny of the polis. The Lycomids traced their lineage to the mythical Lycus, son of Pandion, and performed priestly duties in the mysteries at Phlia, but their political influence had waned by then. His mother, however, according to various ancient sources, was either a Thracian named Abrotonon or a Carian named Euterpe. In any case, she was a foreigner, a barbarian, as the Greeks would say. This circumstance, according to the harsh Athenian laws of the time, made young Themistocles a nothos, illegitimate, or more precisely, a citizen with limited rights, deprived of certain important civil privileges available only to those whose parents were both Athenians. This stigma of being half-breed tempered his character from his earliest years, teaching him resilience and resourcefulness. He constantly had to prove, with redoubled energy, his right to a place under the Athenian sun, to overcome the deeply ingrained prejudices of a conservative society, and to fight persistently for recognition of his talents and abilities. Plutarch notes that due to his origins, Themistocles in his youth engaged in gymnastic exercises, not in the prestigious palaestrae of the city center, but in the Cynosarges, a gymnasium on the outskirts, intended for citizens with limited rights and children of mixed marriages. It is said he cunningly persuaded several youths from noble families to also attend Cynosarges, thereby, as it were, erasing the symbolic line between full citizens and those with limited rights. Plutarch, one of our main and most detailed sources of information about Themistocles, portrays him from youth as an exceptionally ambitious nature, craving fame and recognition. He did not waste precious time on frivolous pursuits so common among spoiled noble youth, such as refined lyre-playing, attending philosophical debates for idle curiosity, or deeply studying the subtleties of the fine arts. His true, all-consuming passion was politics, state affairs, the intrigues of the agora, and the decisions of the popular assembly. It is said that even as a young boy, when asked by his peers what gave him the greatest pleasure, he boldly declared that it was not feasts, nor festivals, nor athletic contests, but the unique opportunity to do something great, something that would leave a mark on the history of his city. This early determination and focus on public activity distinguished him from his peers. He neglected the so-called noble sciences, considered mandatory for aristocratic youth, but eagerly absorbed practical knowledge that could help him in political struggles. His teachers noted his sharp mind and restless character, predicting for him either a great future or great misfortunes. Themistocles' education was more practical, aimed at results, than deeply theoretical and philosophical. He was not a refined thinker or a subtle connoisseur of high poetry, like his future political opponent Aristides or many other aristocratic contemporaries. However, he possessed an incredibly sharp, perceptive mind, a phenomenal memory that reportedly allowed him to remember the names of all Athenian citizens, and the rarest gift of foresight, almost prophetic intuition. He could grasp the very essence of any complex matter with astonishing speed, instantly analyze a rapidly changing situation, and find completely unconventional sometimes paradoxical, but always effective solutions. And most importantly, what distinguished him and became his main weapon, he was a brilliant, unsurpassed orator. In the conditions of Athenian democracy, where virtually all major state issues were decided in the noisy and crowded popular assembly, the ability to persuade the crowd, to master its moods, was not just a useful skill, but a direct key to power and influence. And Themistocles mastered this most complex art to perfection. His speeches were not so much exquisitely beautiful and polished from the perspective of rhetorical canons, as they were extremely energetic, passionate, full of vivid imagery, and perfectly understandable to the common people, with whom he knew how to connect. He spoke their language, addressed their pressing problems, and knew how to present his, sometimes very complex, ideas in an accessible and engaging form. He was not afraid to use harsh expressions, play on the crowd's emotions, sometimes even resorting to demagoguery. But he always achieved his goals. His ascent up the political ladder began, as for many ambitious young Athenians of that time, with his election to the office of Archon Eponymos in 493 BCE. This was one of the highest positions in Athens, granting significant powers, including presiding over the popular assembly and the Areopagus on certain matters. And already then, in this high office, he fully demonstrated his amazing foresight and strategic thinking. Contrary to the prevailing opinion of most Athenian politicians, who considered neighboring Greek city-states like the trade rival Aegina or powerful Sparta as the main threat to Athens, Themistocles saw the true existential danger much further, afield, in the vast expanses of the east. There, like a thundercloud, the colossal Persian Achaemenid Empire was rapidly gaining power and expanding its borders, having already subjected the prosperous Greek city colonies in Ionia on the coast of Asia Minor to its iron scepter. Themistocles was one of the few who clearly realized that a direct confrontation with this gigantic military machine would sooner or later become absolutely inevitable, especially after Athens had aided the Ionian rebels. That is why, as Archon, Themistocles initiated one of his first fateful decisions. He insisted on relocating and radically reorganizing the Athenian military and commercial port. The old Athenian harbor at Laurion was completely open to enemy attacks from the sea, shallow and extremely inconvenient for basing a large fleet. Themistocles, possessing a strategist's keen eye, chose Piraeus for the new port, a place with 3 natural, deep-water and well-protected harbors, Cantharis, Zea, and Munichia. These harbors could be easily fortified with powerful walls and transformed into an impregnable naval citadel. This was a truly revolutionary and far-sighted decision, which laid the solid foundations for Athens' future naval supremacy. Many at the time did not understand his grandiose plans, considering it an unnecessary waste of already scarce state funds. But Themistocles, using all his influence and oratorical skill, managed to insist. He convinced the Athenians that only a strong fleet and a reliable harbor could ensure the security and prosperity of their polis in the coming trials. Work in Piraeus began, and this became the first step towards transforming Athens into a great naval power. He understood that Athens' future lay at sea. Themistocles' grim forebodings about the Persian threat were justified with alarming speed. In 490 BCE, the Persian king Darius I, angered by the aid given by the Athenians and Eretrians to the Ionian Greeks in Asia Minor, who had revolted against Persian rule, especially the burning of Sardis, the capital of the Persian satrapy, dispatched a powerful punitive expedition. Tens of thousands of elite Persian warriors, including their famous cavalry and archers, crossed the Aegean Sea on hundreds of ships and landed on the plain of Marathon, just 42 kilometers, about 26 miles, from the walls of Athens. Panic gripped the city. The Athenians, not receiving the promised military aid from the Spartans in time, who, as usual, cited the need to observe the religious festival of Carneia, which forbade military action until the full moon, found themselves virtually alone against a formidable and numerically superior enemy. At the head of the Athenian militia, composed of brave hoplites, stood the experienced strategist Miltiades, who knew Persian tactics well. Themistocles, most likely, also took direct part in this fateful battle, perhaps as one of the 10 elected strategoi, generals, from his tribe, or simply as an ordinary but valiant hoplite fighting in the front ranks. The Athenian victory at Marathon, achieved thanks to Miltiades' skillful tactics, extending the center and strengthening the flanks, and the incredible courage of the Greek warriors who charged at the Persian arrows, was a true miracle. The small but cohesive Greek force utterly routed and put to flight the superior forces of the mighty Persians. This glorious victory emboldened the Athenians, instilling in them an unprecedented faith in their own strength and the invincibility of their polis. It seemed the threat had passed. Marathon became a symbol of Greek courage and Athenian valor, but Themistocles, unlike most of his ecstatic fellow citizens, did not fall into euphoria after the Marathon triumph. He possessed too sober and perceptive a mind to be deceived by the apparent calm. He understood perfectly well. Marathon was merely the first, albeit brilliantly repulsed, attack. The Persian Empire was vast. Its human and material resources seemed truly inexhaustible. Sooner or later, the Persians would inevitably return, and they would return with much larger, even more formidable forces to avenge their humiliating defeat and definitively conquer defiant Greece. And then, the courage and resilience of the land army of hoplites alone, however great, would be utterly insufficient. Plutarch recounts a noteworthy story that after the Battle of Marathon, Themistocles was often seen pensive, lost in thought, even dejected. To sympathetic inquiries from friends about the cause of his melancholy, he replied with his famous phrase, "The trophies of Miltiades rob me of my sleep." This was not mere envy of the fame and honors of another celebrated commander. It was a deep, agonizing anxiety for the future of his native Athens. He clearly saw that the Persians, possessing a huge and powerful fleet, could deliver a devastating blow from the sea at virtually any, even the most unexpected point on the Attic coast, landing troops where no one would expect them. A land army, however valiant and numerous, physically could not protect the entire lengthy coastline of Attica. The only real way to effectively counter such a naval power as Persia was to create their own powerful navy, equal or even superior to theirs. However, how could he convince the Athenians, who rightly prided themselves on their invincible land army and their recent glorious victory at Marathon, of the urgent necessity to build dozens, even hundreds, of new warships? This undertaking required colossal financial investments, and more importantly, a fundamental change in the entire established military doctrine and even the mentality of Athenian society. Themistocles faced a very strong and authoritative political opponent on this path. Aristides, son of Lysimachus, nicknamed the Just by his supporters, and even some opponents for his impeccable honesty and incorruptibility. Aristides was an influential representative of conservative aristocratic circles, who traditionally relied on wealthy landowners, the very social stratum that formed the backbone and main strike force of the hoplite phalanx. He sincerely believed that Athens should continue to be primarily a land power, and that large-scale fleet construction was nothing more than an empty and ruinous waste of public money, a dangerous departure from ancestral traditions, and an undermining of the foundations of traditional Athenian society. Aristides feared that strengthening the navy would lead to increased political influence for the poorest citizens, the Thetes, who served as rowers, and this would disrupt the existing balance of power in the polis to the detriment of the hoplites and aristocracy. And then, as if by a wave of a benevolent Taish, goddess of fortune, Themistocles was presented with a truly unique, golden opportunity, which he could not miss. In the Laurion silver mines, that inexhaustible source of Athenian wealth located in the far south of Attica, in a harsh and rocky area where thousands of slaves and free laborers toiled day and night extracting precious ore, new, fabulously rich. Veins of high-quality silver were unexpectedly discovered in the Maronea district. This discovery promised the Athenian state colossal, unprecedented revenues. According to a long and sacredly observed tradition in Athens, all such surplus profits from state mines were to be fairly distributed among all full Athenian citizens. Every Athenian with civil rights could expect to receive a one-time payment of 10 full-weight silver drachmas. By the standards of the time, this was a very significant sum, capable of substantially improving the financial situation of many families. And ordinary Athenians, from artisans to small landowners, were already eagerly and joyfully anticipating this generous distribution of state money, making plans for its use. It was precisely at this moment of universal expectation and rosy hopes that Themistocles, challenging established traditions and risking the wrath of the entire demos, appeared before the popular assembly with his truly revolutionary, daring, and at first glance extremely unpopular proposal. He demanded a complete rejection of the customary and universally expected distribution of money, and instead to direct this entire huge, fabulous sum, estimated by various ancient historians at 100 or even 200 talents of pure silver, a colossal fortune capable of financing an entire military campaign, towards the urgent and large-scale construction of no fewer than 100 new modern warships, triremes, those formidable wooden walls of future Athenian might. One can easily imagine the storm of indignation and outrage this proposal caused in the popular assembly. To effectively take away money citizens had almost received for some vague and distant Persian threat that many had already largely forgotten after the resounding victory at Marathon? It seemed like madness. Here, Themistocles displayed in all its brilliance not only his outstanding oratorical talent, but also his extraordinary political cunning, his ability to maneuver and find unexpected arguments. He understood perfectly well that speaking directly about a future war with Persia, which many considered already over, would be counterproductive. Instead, he pointed the Athenians to a much closer, more understandable, and more hated enemy, the neighboring island of Aegina, a long-standing and irreconcilable commercial and military rival of Athens. The war with Aegina, flaring up and dying down, had smoldered for many decades, and the Athenians well remembered the numerous grievances inflicted upon them by Aeginetan pirates and merchants. Themistocles passionately convinced his fellow citizens that a new, powerful fleet was vitally necessary for Athens precisely to finally crush Aegina and ensure the safety of Athenian maritime trade. And the Athenians, though reluctantly, unwilling to part with the expected money, eventually yielded to his persuasions and agreed. It was a brilliant political ploy. Formally, the fleet was being built to fight Aegina, but Themistocles, unlike most, understood perfectly well who its real, main, and most formidable opponent would be in the near future. According to some versions, he even proposed not just to hand over the money to the state, but to lend it to the 100 wealthiest Athenian citizens, 1 talent each, on the condition that each of them build a trireme. And if their use was approved by the people, the ships would remain with the state. If not, the wealthy would return the money. Such a formula might have softened the discontent. The fierce political struggle between Themistocles, representing the interests of the more democratic and commercial artisan strata of the population, and Aristides, expressing the views of the conservative landowning aristocracy, reached its peak Their deep disagreements concerned not only the necessity of building the fleet, but also the entire future development path of the Athenian state, its foreign policy orientation and internal structure. In 483 or 482 BCE, this sharp confrontation led to the use of Ostracism, a special popular vote using clay shards, known as ostraca, in which Athenian citizens decided which of the most influential politicians posed the greatest potential threat to the existing democratic order and should be temporarily, for 10 years, exiled from the city. Ostracism was conceived by Cleisthenes as a means of preventing tyranny, but in practice, it became an instrument of political struggle. As a result of this vote, the majority of votes were cast against Aristides the Just. Plutarch tells the famous anecdote of an illiterate peasant asking Aristides to write the name Aristides on his shard because he was tired of hearing everyone call him the Just. Aristides, without revealing his name, complied with the request. The path for the unimpeded implementation of Themistocles' ambitious plans to create a great Athenian fleet was finally completely cleared. Athens began to build its fleet feverishly, with unprecedented energy. The shipyards of Piraeus and Laurion buzzed with the continuous sound of axes and hammers. Timber was needed for construction, brought from Thrace and Macedonia, as well as resin, hemp, and metal for nails and ram sheathing. By 480 BCE, when the terrible Persian storm once again loomed over Greece, Athens already had about 200 fully equipped and crewed triremes. It was the largest, most modern, and most combat-ready fleet in all of Hellas. Themistocles did not just achieve the construction of hundreds of new ships. He accomplished something much greater. He managed to change the very mentality of the Athenians. He began to transform them from predominantly land-based farmers and hoplite warriors into a skilled and courageous maritime nation. Now, the main pillar of Athenian military power and political influence became not only heavily armed hoplites from wealthy strata, but also the Thetes, the poorest Athenian citizens, who could not afford expensive hoplite armor, but who now served en masse as rowers on triremes and formed the core of the naval crews. This also had far-reaching domestic political consequences, significantly strengthening the role and influence of the common demos in state governance and further consolidating Athenian democracy. While Athens, under Themistocles' wise leadership, hastily built its fleet, preparing for new trials, the vast Persian Empire wasted no time and meticulously prepared for a crushing revenge for the Marathon humiliation. The new Persian king, Xerxes I, the ambitious and powerful son of Darius, assembled a truly unprecedented army for those times and a colossal fleet from all corners of his immense empire. Preparations took several years. Canals were dug, for example, through the Athos Peninsula to avoid dangerous capes, and food depots were built along the route. The ancient historian Herodotus, rightly called the father of history, provides utterly fantastic, almost unbelievable figures in his works. Millions of foot soldiers, hundreds of thousands of horsemen, thousands of warships and transport vessels. Modern historians, of course, treat these figures with considerable skepticism and consider them significantly inflated, a product of either ancient hyperbole or propaganda. But even considering all possible corrections, Xerxes' army was indeed enormous. Perhaps 200,000 to 300,000 warriors and about 1,200 ships, far outnumbering anything united Greece could field, and seemingly capable of crushing any army and any state of the then-known world. In the summer of 480 BCE, after several unsuccessful attempts and grandiose engineering works, the innumerable Persian hordes crossed the Hellespont, now known as the Dardanelles Strait, via specially constructed giant pontoon bridges made of lashed-together ships and, like an all-crushing avalanche, moved south into the very heart of Greece. Unspeakable terror gripped most Greek city-states. Many of them, especially those located in northern Hellas, not daring even to think of resisting such an armada, submitted to the Persians without a fight, hastily sending Xerxes earth and water, the traditional Eastern sign of complete and unconditional submission. However, Athens and Sparta, the two largest and most influential Greek city-states, along with several dozen other smaller but no less courageous cities, decided to fight to the last drop of blood for their freedom and independence. To coordinate joint military actions and develop a common strategy, a pan-Hellenic defensive alliance, the so-called Hellenic League, was hastily created, though even within it, there was no complete unity. Supreme command was given to Sparta as the most authoritative military power. In confusion and anxiety, the Greeks turned for advice to the Delphic Oracle, the most famous and authoritative oracle in all of Hellas, whose priests were considered the mouthpiece of the god Apollo himself. The Pythia's, the priestess-prophetess answer was, as often, extremely grim, ambiguous, and obscure. She foretold terrible disasters for Greece, the death of many people, and the destruction of cities. But at the very end of her ominous prophecy, she added one enigmatic phrase that offered a faint glimmer of hope. Only wooden walls does Zeus grant, to Tritogeneia Athena to remain unbreached, for your salvation and that of your descendants. Another prophecy spoke of divine Salamis, which will destroy the children of women. But how were these mysterious wooden walls to be understood? Opinions among the Greeks were sharply divided. Some, more conservatively minded, believed it referred to the ancient wooden palisade that had once surrounded the sacred Athenian Acropolis and proposed taking refuge behind it. Others, mainly Peloponnesians, suggested fortifying the narrow isthmus of Corinth, which connected the Peloponnese to the rest of mainland Greece, with a powerful wall and concentrating all forces for defense there, effectively abandoning all of central Greece, including Athens, to its fate. But Themistocles, as always, had his own completely original and bold interpretation of this divine prediction. He resolutely declared before the popular assembly that the wooden walls mentioned by the oracle were none other than the ships of the Athenian fleet. Only the fleet, in his deep conviction, could save Athens and all of Greece from inevitable enslavement. Based on this, he proposed a truly daring and desperate plan to evacuate the entire civilian population of Athens, women, children, the elderly, the sick, to the nearby island of Salamis and the friendly city of Troezen in the Peloponnese. All able-bodied men were to board the triremes and give the Persian fleet a decisive general battle at sea. The phrase about Salamis destroying the children of women, by his interpretation, referred to the enemies, not the Athenians. This was an incredibly difficult, agonizing decision for every Athenian. To leave their native city, their homes, their shrines, the graves of their ancestors to the inevitable plunder and desecration by a ruthless enemy. For an ancient Greek, his polis was not just a place of residence. It was his small homeland, his sanctuary, the center of his entire world, his identity. Many Athenians were in complete despair, unable to reconcile themselves to such a prospect. But Themistocles, using all his unsurpassed eloquence, presenting irresistible arguments, not shying away from threats and even, as some ancient authors claim, not disdaining the secret bribery of influential individuals, eventually managed to persuade the wavering popular assembly to accept his radical plan. A special Sophisma, official decree, was issued, mandating the immediate and complete evacuation of the city. The Athenians, with heavy hearts but with faith in their leader, began to leave their doomed city. Meanwhile, the combined Greek land and naval forces desperately tried to delay the inexorable advance of the Persian hordes on land and sea. The narrow mountain pass of Thermopylae, the hot gates of Greece, was heroically defended by a small but legendary detachment of 300 Spartans, led by their king Leonidas, along with several thousand warriors from other Greek city-states, including Thebans and Thespians. Their task was to delay the Persian army as much as possible, to give the rest of Greece time to mobilize and evacuate its population. Simultaneously, the combined Greek fleet, where Athenian ships under Themistocles' de facto leadership constituted the most numerous and combat-ready part, fought a fierce battle against the gigantic Persian fleet off the northern tip of the island of Euboea at Cape Artemisium. Formal command of the entire combined Greek fleet belonged to the Spartan navarch Eurybiades, as other Greek allies, especially the Corinthians and Aeginetans, who were jealous of Athens' growing influence, categorically refused to obey an Athenian, Strategist. But the de facto leader, the brain center, and the true soul of all Greek naval resistance was, without a doubt, Themistocles. He even resorted to ruses. According to Herodotus, he carved messages on stones near water sources for the Ionian Greeks serving in the Persian fleet, urging them either to defect to the Hellenes or to fight listlessly. The naval battle at Artemisium continued with varying success for 3 days and did not bring a decisive victory to either side. But the Greeks showed they could confront the Persians at sea. The Greeks fought with exceptional courage and suffered heavy losses, but the huge Persian fleet also lost many ships, partly due to a severe storm that the gods, it seemed, sent to aid the Hellenes, sinking about 400 Persian ships even before the main battles began. The main outcome of the Battle of Artemisium was that the Greek sailors, especially the Athenians, gained invaluable combat experience against the Persian fleet and saw firsthand that Persian ships and sailors, despite their numerical superiority, were by no means as invincible as previously thought. When the tragic news arrived of the heroic demise of King Leonidas's detachment at Thermopylae, betrayed by a local named Ephialtes, and that the Persian army's path into central Greece was now completely open, the Greek fleet, having fulfilled its task of diverting part of the Persian forces and covering the evacuation of Euboea, withdrew in an organized manner southwards to the island of Salamis, where the evacuated Athenian families were already located. The Persians, encountering no more serious resistance on land, poured into Attica in an unstoppable flood. Athens was empty, abandoned by its inhabitants. Xerxes, enraged by the stubborn and audacious resistance of the Athenians who dared to challenge him, ordered the city to be put to the torch and the sword, and the sacred temples of the Acropolis to be razed to the ground. Themistocles' dream of saving wooden walls was undergoing its harshest and most ruthless test by reality. Thus, the entire civilian population of Athens was successfully evacuated. The ancient and glorious city lay in smoking ruins. The combined Greek fleet, significantly outnumbered by the enemy, was stationed in the narrow, winding strait between the coast of Attica and the island of Salamis. The enormous Persian fleet, numbering, according to Herodotus, about 1,200 warships against approximately 370 to 380 Greek vessels, of which about 200 were Athenian triremes built on Themistocles' initiative, completely controlled all approaches to the Salamis Strait from the open sea. The Greeks' position seemed utterly desperate, almost hopeless. Among the Greek commanders gathered for a war council on Salamis, despondency, confusion, and sharp disagreements reigned. Most of them, primarily the Peloponnesians led by the formal commander, the Spartan Eurybiades, frightened by the burning of Athens and the enemy's overwhelming numerical superiority, insistently demanded an immediate retreat to the isthmus of Corinth. They believed that the only chance of salvation was to concentrate all forces for the defense of the Peloponnese, and that a risky battle in the Salamis Strait, with such a disparity of forces, was doomed to an inevitable and catastrophic failure. If the Greek fleet were defeated here, at Salamis, then the entire Peloponnese, their homeland, would be utterly defenseless against a possible Persian landing from the sea. The wall on the isthmus, which they were hastily building, could not hold back the Persians if they dominated the sea. Themistocles was categorically, fiercely against such a cowardly, in his opinion, and disastrous plan. He understood perfectly well that retreating to the isthmus under these circumstances would be tantamount to the complete and final defeat of all Greece. Firstly, it would mean cynically abandoning not only the evacuated Athenian women and children to the enraged enemy, but also the inhabitants of other Aegean islands who were still resisting. Secondly, as an experienced naval strategist, he realized that in the open sea space near the Isthmus of Corinth, the overwhelming numerical superiority of the huge Persian fleet would become an absolutely decisive factor. The narrow and winding Salamis Strait, on the other hand, largely neutralized this numerical advantage of the Persians, preventing them from fully deploying all their numerous forces and using their favorite tactic of massive envelopment and encirclement, the periplus. Here, in these confined waters, the lighter, more maneuverable and better prepared Greek triremes, crewed by experienced and desperate men, could fight the Persians, if not on equal terms, then with much greater chances of success. The Greeks could use the tactic of breaking the line, diekplus, and ramming. The debates at the War Council were incredibly heated and fierce, sometimes becoming personal. The Corinthian strategos Adimantus, known for his animosity towards the Athenians and Themistocles personally, even openly insulted him, remarking caustically, "Themistocles, at the games, those who start too soon are beaten with rods." To this audacity, Themistocles, without losing his composure, immediately and wittily retorted, "Yes, that is so. But those who are left behind at the start and come last are never crowned with the victor's wreaths." When the Spartan Eurybiades, finally, driven out of his wits by Themistocles' unyielding persistence and sharp arguments, angrily raised his commander's staff at him, the Athenian strategos, without even flinching, calmly and with dignity uttered his famous, historically recorded phrase, "Strike, if you will, but listen first." Seeing that he could not persuade the stubborn Peloponnesians with reasonable arguments alone, Themistocles resorted to an extreme measure, a direct threat. He firmly declared that if the allied Greek fleet still decided to retreat from Salamis to the Isthmus, then the Athenians, who constituted more than half of all Hellenic naval forces, would immediately embark all their families and remaining property onto their ships and sail away forever to distant Italy to found a new, free colony, leaving the rest of Greece to its fate. This decisive threat had its effect. The loss of the Athenian fleet, the most numerous, most combat-ready, and most experienced in all of Greece, would mean the inevitable and swift collapse of all pan-Hellenic resistance. Eurybiades and other Peloponnesian commanders, though with great reluctance and evident displeasure, were forced to yield and agree to remain at Salamis and give the Persians a general battle right there. At this moment, according to some accounts, Aristides, recently recalled from ostracism on Themistocles' own initiative in the face of common danger, also appeared at the council. Aristides supported Themistocles, reporting that the exits from the strait were already blocked by the Persians, and it was too late to flee. But Themistocles understood perfectly well that the Persian king Xerxes, having such an overwhelming advantage, might not risk a battle in the narrow strait, so unfavorable for his huge fleet. Xerxes could simply blockade the small Greek fleet in the Salamis Strait, cutting off its supplies, while he himself calmly landed his land forces in the Peloponnese, bypassing the Isthmian fortifications by sea. It was necessary, at all costs, to compel the proud and impatient Persian king to attack the Greek fleet immediately, the very next day, and precisely here, in the Salamis narrows. And then, the cunning Themistocles resorted to his most famous and audacious military ruse, which largely decided the outcome of the entire campaign. Late at night, he secretly sent his most loyal and devoted slave, Sicinnus, a Persian by origin, who knew the Persian language and customs well and was his children's tutor, to King Xerxes. Sicinnus was to deliver a secret message from Themistocles. In this message, the Athenian Strategist, ostensibly out of secret sympathy for the powerful Persians and seriously fearing for his own fate in the event of what he described as the inevitable defeat of the Greeks, informed the Persian king that complete panic and disarray reigned among the Greeks, and that they had already decided to secretly weigh anchor the very next night and try to escape from the Salamis Strait. Themistocles amicably advised Xerxes not to miss such a convenient moment, to immediately attack the disorganized and demoralized Greek fleet, and to tightly seal all exits from the Salamis Strait so that not a single Greek ship could escape and avoid complete annihilation. This brilliant ploy was subtly calculated based on Xerxes' own psychology. The Persian king was known for his immense arrogance, unwavering confidence in his overwhelming military superiority, and passionate desire to achieve a quick, decisive, and final victory over the defiant Greeks, so he could return triumphantly to his capital as soon as possible. The secret message from Themistocles perfectly matched his own expectations, confirmed his worst fears about a possible Greek escape, and undoubtedly flattered his excessive pride. Moreover, he genuinely feared that if the Greek fleet managed to slip away now, the war could be unacceptably prolonged, depleting the resources of his huge army. Xerxes completely believed the cunning report. Without losing a moment, he ordered his fleet to immediately enter the narrow Salamis Strait and completely block all possible exits from it, to cut off the Greeks' escape routes. Part of the Persian fleet, the Egyptian squadron, was sent to block the western strait between Salamis and Megara. The Persian ships maneuvered feverishly in the dark all night long, taking up their assigned positions and trying to encircle the, as they thought, unsuspecting Greek fleet. By the morning of the next day, the Persian sailors, exhausted by a sleepless night and tense maneuvering, were severely fatigued and morally drained. Early in the morning of September 20th, or according to some other sources, September 28th, 480 BCE, the famous Battle of Salamis began, one of the greatest and most significant naval battles in world history. The Greek fleet, drawn up in 2 or possibly 3 battle lines, calmly and confidently awaited the enemy's appearance in the narrow straits. The Athenians held the left flank, the Spartans and other Peloponnesians the right, and the ships of the other allies were in the center. The huge and unwieldy Persian ships, one after another, heavily entered the narrows of the Salamis Strait, where they immediately became cramped. They inevitably began to crowd together, bumping into each other, hindering their own neighbors' maneuvers, and breaking their oars. At that very moment, the lighter, swifter, and incredibly maneuverable Greek triremes, crewed by experienced and desperate men as a single organism, launched a furious attack to the sound of the battle paean and trumpets. The battle was incredibly fierce and bloody on both sides. The Greeks fought with the desperate courage of doomed men, defending in full view of their families, their last hopes, their shrines, their freedom, and their very lives. The Athenians, whose homes and temples had just been barbarously burned and destroyed by the Persians, fought with particular indomitable fury, avenging their desecrated homeland. Themistocles himself, according to eyewitnesses, was in the thick of this deadly fray on his flagship, inspiring his warriors to heroic deeds by personal example and skillfully directing the course of the entire battle. Aeschylus, a participant in the battle, later described it in his tragedy. The Persians. The narrowness of the strait, as Themistocles had calculated, played its decisive role. The The Persians were never able to effectively use their overwhelming numerical superiority. Their huge, tall, but less maneuverable ships collided with each other in the confusion, broke their numerous oars, lost control, and became easy prey for the swift Greek triremes. The Greek ships, equipped with powerful bronze-sheathed rams on their prows, smashed into the sides of the clumsy Persian vessels at speed, crushed their oars, disabling them, and then, locking ships side by side, Greek hoplites stationed on the decks of the triremes bravely boarded and engaged in fierce hand-to-hand combat with Persian warriors and sailors. The Aeginetans particularly distinguished themselves. According to Herodotus, they acted most skillfully and bravely, attacking the Persian flank. Paradoxically, Artemisia, the valiant queen of Caria, a region in Asia Minor, who was an ally of the Persians and personally commanded her squadron of 5 ships, particularly distinguished herself in this battle. She fought so bravely and skillfully, sinking several Greek vessels, that Xerxes himself, anxiously watching the disastrous course of the battle for him from his high golden throne set up on one of the coastal hills of Attica, Mount Aegaleos, involuntarily exclaimed upon seeing her valor, "My men have become women in this battle, while my women, on the contrary, have proven themselves true men." By the evening of that long and bloody day, the huge and once formidable Persian fleet was completely routed and partially destroyed. Hundreds of Persian ships were sunk, burned, or captured by the Greeks as trophies. Thousands of Persian warriors and sailors drowned in the waters of the Salamis Strait, or were mercilessly slaughtered by the Greeks on its shores when they tried to reach land. Aristides, with a detachment of hoplites, landed on the island of Citylea, where the Persians had stationed a contingent and annihilated it. Greek losses, though significant, about 40 ships, were incomparably smaller. Xerxes, in utter horror and despair, watched this monstrous catastrophe, the demise of his, as he thought, invincible fleet. The victory at Salamis had truly immense, epoch-making strategic and moral significance. It not only saved Athens and the rest of Greece from seemingly inevitable and complete subjugation by the Persians, but also became a true turning point in the entire multi-year war between the Greeks and Persians. Xerxes, deeply shaken by such a crushing defeat and seriously fearing that the victorious Greeks might now destroy his pontoon bridges across the Hellespont, thereby completely cutting off his and his army's retreat route to Asia, hastily, almost panikedly, left Greece with the bulk of his land forces. He did, however, leave his experienced and brave general Mardonius in Thessaly with an elite force, variously estimated at 50 to 300,000 warriors, to try to continue the war on land the following year. But the main, most terrible threat to Greece had passed. The initiative in the war had definitively passed to the Hellenes. Themistocles instantly became the true hero of all Hellas, its savior and idol. His incredible foresight in assessing the Persian threat, his unwavering persistence in creating a powerful Athenian navy, his brilliant strategic genius, and his unsurpassed cunning, demonstrated during the preparation and execution of the Battle of Salamis. All this brought Greece a great victory and saved its civilization. Even the always proud Spartans, jealously regarding any Athenian successes, were forced this time to publicly acknowledge his outstanding services to all of Hellas. They bestowed upon him the highest honor they could award a non-Spartan, a precious olive wreath, usually awarded only to victors of the sacred Olympic Games. When Themistocles appeared at the next Olympic Games shortly thereafter, the huge crowds of spectators, gathered from all corners of the Greek world, temporarily forgetting the athletic contests themselves, rose as one and greeted their savior with thunderous, unceasing applause. It was the true triumph of his life. Plutarch writes that in Sparta, he was accorded such honor as no foreigner had ever received. The Spartans awarded him a wreath for wisdom and Eurybiades a wreath for valor. And they also presented Themistocles with the best chariot and escorted him to the border with 300 elite horsemen. After the glorious Salamis victory and the final expulsion of the remaining Persian forces from Greece, which occurred after the decisive victories of the combined Greek forces at the Battle of Plataea on land, where the Spartan commander Pausanias defeated Mardonius, and at Mycale by sea in 479 BCE, where the Greek fleet under the command of the Spartan king Leotychides and the Athenian Xanthippus, Pericles' father, destroyed the remnants of the Persian fleet and burned their camp, where Themistocles, though no longer playing a leading role directly on the battlefield, saw his created fleet continue to ensure Hellenic naval supremacy and support land operations. Athens found itself at the very pinnacle of its fame, power, and influence throughout the Greek world. The city, so cruelly destroyed and burned by the Persians, needed not just to be rebuilt from ruins, but to be rebuilt anew, made even more beautiful and powerful than before. And here Themistocles again, as before, demonstrated his amazing foresight and dynamic energy. He understood perfectly well that peace with the vast Persian Empire, despite its recent defeats, was still very fragile and unreliable, and that envy and apprehension from Sparta, the traditional hegemon in Greece, would now only steadily grow as Athens strengthened. Athens, more than ever, needed new, even more powerful and reliable city fortifications. Themistocles immediately proposed surrounding the reviving city with new, much taller, thicker, and stronger walls, capable of withstanding any siege. The Spartans, seriously fearing such an excessive and rapid strengthening of Athens, which could become their dangerous rival for leadership in Hellas, tried every means to prevent this. They hastily sent their ambassadors to Athens, who insistently urged the Athenians not to build new walls, using the hypocritical pretext that this was to prevent the enemy, in case of a new Persian invasion, from using fortified Athens as a powerful military base in the heart of Greece. The hypocrisy and falsity of this pretext were perfectly obvious to anyone with even a little political understanding. Themistocles, here again, brilliantly applied his favorite cunning and diplomatic skill. He himself volunteered to go to Sparta as an Athenian ambassador for negotiations, while secretly ordering his fellow Athenians to immediately, without losing a single day, begin the forced construction of new city walls, using absolutely all available materials, including even tombstones from old cemeteries and stones from temples and public buildings destroyed by the Persians. In Sparta itself, Themistocles deliberately delayed the start of official negotiations, sometimes complaining of his supposed ill health, sometimes stating that he was awaiting the arrival of other Athenian ambassadors who, he claimed, were to bring him new, more detailed instructions from the Athenian government. Meanwhile, the entire population of Athens, men and women, old people, and even children, worked tirelessly, day and night, on the construction of the life-saving walls. When the new Athenian walls reached sufficient height and strength to provide the city with reliable protection, Themistocles finally, openly and proudly, declared to the astonished and annoyed Spartan ephors that Athens was now securely enclosed by impregnable walls and quite capable of defending itself against any enemy without needing anyone's advice or permission. The Spartans, faced with a fait accompli, had no choice but to conceal their irritation and accept this unwelcome strengthening of Athens. These walls, built in such haste, became known as the Themistoclean Walls. But Themistocles' main, truly strategic project in this post-war period was initiating the construction of the so-called Long Walls. These were two powerful stone walls, running parallel to each other at a considerable distance, intended to connect the main urban area of Athens with its new fortified port of Piraeus, which he himself had once chosen and begun to develop. These long walls, each about 6 to 7 kilometers, around 4 miles in length, effectively transformed Athens and its port Piraeus into a single huge fortress, virtually impregnable to any contemporary enemy. A third Phaleric wall was built later. Even if an enemy army managed to devastate the entire surrounding Attic countryside and blockade Athens by land, the city, having reliable and safe access to the sea and its port Piraeus via the long walls, could be freely supplied with food, weapons, and everything necessary by sea routes and continue resistance almost indefinitely. This ingenious engineering and strategic solution provided Athens with a colossal military advantage for many decades to come and became one of the main material foundations of its future naval might and the prosperity of the so-called Athenian maritime empire, better known as the First Athenian League or Delian League. Themistocles also fortified Piraeus itself, surrounding it with powerful walls and making it Athens's main naval base. He saw Piraeus as the key to the city's future prosperity and security, encouraging merchants and craftsmen to move there. Themistocles was at the very peak of his popularity, fame, and political influence. He was the universally recognized architect of the great victory over the Persians, the savior of his country, the man who, by his will and genius, transformed Athens from an ordinary Greek polis into the leading naval power of the entire Mediterranean. However, as is unfortunately often the case in history, great merits and immense power breed no less great envy and many hidden and overt enemies. And Themistocles' own complex and contradictory character, his unconcealed self-confidence, at times bordering on outright arrogance, his ostentatious love for luxury and wealth, his constant desire to publicly emphasize his exceptional services to the polis, all this gradually earned him more and more influential and dangerous detractors, especially among the old aristocracy. He built a sanctuary to Artemis Aristoboule, Artemis of best counsel, near his house, which many considered a display of excessive pride. His numerous political opponents, mainly from conservative aristocratic circles, who could never forgive him his rapid rise, his democratic sympathies, and the diminution of their own influence, began actively weaving sophisticated intrigues against him and spreading slanderous rumors. He was increasingly accused of excessive, almost tyrannical ambition, of a secret desire to establish sole power, and of disrespect for the ancient gods and sacred traditions of his ancestors. Persistent rumors spread through Athens about his alleged bribery, for example, in distributing spoils or settling disputes among allies, and even of secret, treacherous dealings with the Persian court, which was a particularly cynical and false accusation, given his decisive role in the recent war with Persia. Gradually but inexorably, Themistocles' once boundless popularity among the broad masses began to wane and fade. The Athenian demos, like any democratic system, was very fickle in its sympathies and extremely suspicious of all overly influential and prominent individuals, fearing a restoration of tyranny. Moreover, after the glorious end of the War of Liberation, other new leaders began to come to the fore in Athenian politics, such as Cimon, the valiant son of Miltiades, the legendary hero of the Battle of Marathon. Cimon was a talented and successful commander, a representative of the noble aristocracy. But he also knew how to skillfully get along with the demos, generously spending his wealth on them, for example, by hosting public dinners or opening his gardens to all. He represented a more moderate political wing, striving for reconciliation and cooperation with Sparta, in contrast to Themistocles' anti-Spartan policy, who continued to see Sparta as Athens' main rival. Themistocles' opponents skillfully used all his real and imagined mistakes, weaknesses, and miscalculations in their propaganda. They constantly reminded the people of his not entirely pure-blooded, non-aristocratic origins, his inordinate vanity, and his thirst for power. Gradually, the clouds over the head of the great strategist and savior of Athens thickened, and so, in 471 or, according to other sources, 472 BCE, Themistocles, the man to whom Athens owed its salvation and its future greatness, was subjected to ostracism. The majority of Athenian citizens, gathered in the Agora, voted with their clay shards for his exile from his native city for 10 long years. Such was the cruel irony of fate and the harsh, at times ungrateful nature of Athenian democracy. Exiled from Athens, Themistocles initially settled in Argos, a large and influential city in the Peloponnese, which traditionally feuded with Sparta and therefore gladly welcomed the disgraced Athenian politician. But even here, his numerous and powerful enemies did not leave him in peace. The Spartans, who had long and fiercely hated Themistocles for his anti-Spartan policy and the strengthening of Athens, did not miss the opportunity to finally destroy him. They brought a new, even more serious charge against him: high treason, specifically secret participation in the so-called conspiracy of the Spartan commander Pausanias, the victor of Plataea, who, they claimed, was conducting secret, treacherous negotiations with the Persian king to establish tyranny in Greece. Whether these terrible accusations against Themistocles were even remotely justified, or whether it was pure provocation and slander, still remains a subject of sharp debate among historians. Perhaps Themistocles, in exile, deeply embittered and offended by his ungrateful fellow citizens, did indeed desperately seek some contacts with the Persians, viewing them as potential allies against Sparta, or even as a possible refuge. Letters allegedly written by him to Pausanias exist, but their authenticity is doubtful. Or perhaps it was all just a cunningly planned and brilliantly executed intrigue by his Athenian and Spartan enemies, aimed at his complete discredit and physical elimination. Whatever the case, the Athenians, under strong pressure from powerful Sparta and fearing its wrath, sentenced Themistocles, their former hero, to death in absentia and full confiscation of all his considerable property. Now, not just the threat of political oblivion hung over his head, but the real danger of imminent death. He was forced to flee again, saving his life. Thus began a long and agonizing period of his wanderings through various corners of the Greek world. He sought refuge first on the island of Corcyra, modern Corfu, whose inhabitants owed him for his help in a dispute with Corinth. But even there, fearing the vengeance of Athenians and Spartans, he was denied a long stay. Then, when it became unsafe there too, he moved to Epirus, to Admetus, king of the warlike Molossian tribe. Plutarch tells us a very touching and dramatic story of how Themistocles, pursued relentlessly by his merciless enemies, despairing of finding a safe haven, decided to resort to the protection of King Admetus, who, ironically, was his old and sworn enemy, as Themistocles had once prevented Admetus from receiving aid from Athens. To soften the heart of the stern king and secure his patronage, Themistocles, upon entering the palace, snatched Admetus's young son into his arms, and with the child in his arms, sat by the sacred domestic hearth. This was an ancient and inviolable custom of supplication for protection, which even the bitterest enemy could not violate without incurring the wrath of the gods. King Admetus, deeply moved by such a desperate and humiliated position of his former adversary, and respecting the sacred customs of hospitality, did not hand Themistocles over to his pursuers and granted him temporary refuge, later helping him to move on. But even in wild, mountainous Epirus, it was extremely dangerous to stay long. In the end, after long and painful deliberations, Themistocles made the most desperate, most unthinkable, and most paradoxical decision of his life: to seek refuge and protection not from just anyone, but from the very Persian king against whom he had once fought so fiercely and so successfully, and to whom he had caused so much harm. This was a new Persian king, Artaxerxes I Longimanus, son and heir of Xerxes. Imagine for a moment the full depth of the tragedy, the bitter irony of this incredible situation. The greatest and most implacable enemy of the Persians, the man who was the chief architect of their crushing defeats, now himself seeks salvation and mercy at the Persian court! Themistocles secretly, with great precautions, crossed the Aegean Sea to Asia Minor, to Ephesus, into territory controlled by the Persians, and from there sent Artaxerxes his famous letter. In it, not without pride, he reminded the king that he, Themistocles, had in his time brought the Persians much harm, but, as he claimed, he had also brought them considerable benefit, as it was he who, after the crushing battle of Salamis, had allegedly dissuaded the triumphant Greeks from immediately pursuing Xerxes' shattered fleet and from destroying the Hellespont bridges vital to the Persians, which, by all appearances, was true. Themistocles, as a wise strategist, understood perfectly well that an enemy cornered and deprived of escape routes becomes doubly dangerous and will fight with the desperation of the doomed. He humbly asked Artaxerxes to give him 1 year to study the Persian language and local customs, after which he, Themistocles, could serve the Persian king faithfully, using all his knowledge, experience, and talents. Artaxerxes, who had undoubtedly heard much about Themistocles' great fame and outstanding abilities, was apparently quite impressed by such incredible boldness and such an unexpected turn of events. Perhaps he also soberly calculated on using the unique knowledge and rich military experience of this famous Greek for his own purposes in the future, for example, against those same Greeks. In any case, the Persian king received Themistocles with great honor and respect. Plutarch writes that the king was so pleased that he even jumped up in his sleep, shouting, "I have Themistocles the Athenian." Themistocles, possessing a sharp mind and an amazing ability to adapt, indeed learned the complex Persian language quite quickly, thoroughly mastered all the subtleties of court etiquette, and soon became one of the Persian king's highly respected and trusted advisors. As a sign of special favor and to ensure his comfortable existence, he was granted governance over 3 rich and prosperous Greek cities in Asia Minor: Magnesia on the Meander, to supply him with bread and other agricultural products; Lampsacus, to provide him with the best wines; and Myus, to supply him with other necessary provisions and fish. Thus, the former savior of Greece and Persia's bitterest enemy became a high-ranking satrap, a governor for the Persian king on Persian territory. It was a truly astonishing and tragic end to his turbulent career. He even minted his own coins in Magnesia. Unfortunately, not many reliable facts are known about the last years of Themistocles' life spent in Persia. He lived surrounded by luxury, honor, and outward well-being. But, according to Plutarch's insightful words, he deeply and unceasingly longed for his distant homeland, for Athens, and for the deafening fame and boundless influence he once had in free Greece. It is said that he often bitterly repeated to his children, who lived with him in exile, "Oh, my children, we would be utterly ruined now if we had not been so thoroughly ruined back then," meaning that their current prosperity in Persia was bought at the price of his exile and the loss of everything dear to him in his homeland. There is a very famous and dramatic legend, also recounted by Plutarch, that when the Persian king Artaxerxes allegedly intended to start a new major war against Greece, perhaps during the Egyptian revolt supported by Athens, and demanded that Themistocles, as his loyal vassal and experienced commander, lead the Persian fleet and army in this campaign. Themistocles, unwilling under any circumstances to fight against his former compatriots and raise arms against his homeland, chose to voluntarily end his life. Legend has it that he committed suicide by courageously drinking a cup of fresh bull's blood, which was considered a deadly poison in those times. This is, undoubtedly, a very beautiful, heroic, and tragic story, portraying Themistocles as a true patriot to his very end, incapable of betraying the ideals of his youth, even under threat of death. However, most modern historians, including such an authoritative ancient author as Thucydides, who was a contemporary of these events, offer a more prosaic and, apparently, more reliable version of his death. According to Thucydides, Themistocles died of a sudden illness in the city of Magnesia on the Meander, where he was governor around 459 BCE at the age of about 65. Before his death, according to tradition, he secretly bequeathed to his relatives and friends that after his demise, his ashes should be carefully transported to his homeland, Attica, and secretly buried on native soil, which, it is said, was done by them with great precautions. His tomb, according to some later accounts, was supposedly located somewhere near Piraeus, his beloved creation, the port he himself had once founded and fortified, and which became a symbol of Athens's naval might. Pausanias, a writer of the 2nd century CE, claimed to have seen his tomb near the pier in Piraeus. What, then, is Themistocles' historical legacy? It is truly immense, multifaceted, and, like his entire life, highly contradictory. Undoubtedly, he was a brilliant, unsurpassed strategist, and one of the most perceptive and effective politicians of his time, and perhaps of all ancient history. His astonishing foresight in accurately assessing the scale and inevitability of the Persian threat, his indomitable persistence and political will in creating a powerful Athenian navy against all odds, his cunning and brilliantly executed strategic plan for the Battle of Salamis, all this in Sovacoupnosti saved not only his native Athens but all of Greece from inevitable subjugation and possibly from the complete disappearance of its unique civilization. Without Themistocles and his wooden walls, the history not only of Greece but of all Western civilization, heir to Hellenic culture, might have taken a completely different, unpredictable, and probably much darker path. He was the true architect and creator of Athens's naval power. His wooden walls, that is, his fleet, and his long walls, his fortifications, became the reliable material basis of the Athenian maritime empire. The so-called arche, which dominated the Aegean basin for almost the entire 5th century BCE and contributed to the unprecedented flourishing of Athenian democracy, science, art, philosophy, and literature. The very period we know as the Golden Age of Pericles. The strengthening of the role of the Thetes, who served in the fleet, led to the further democratization of Athenian society, as these men, who shed blood for their country, demanded and received ever more political rights. However, one cannot deny that his methods of achieving his goals were often far from ethical ideals and accepted norms. He was an unsurpassed master of political intrigue, not shying away, when he deemed it necessary, from bribery, deceit, or demagoguery to achieve his state or personal objectives. His inordinate ambition, his unconcealed self-confidence, and at times overt arrogance alienated many worthy people and created dangerous enemies for him.
And his forced yet voluntary transition to the service of the Persian king, even if made in the desperate position of an exile, still cast an indelible shadow on his previously impeccable reputation as a great patriot in the eyes of some of his
contemporaries and many subsequent generations. Themistocles is one of the most striking and instructive examples of the so-called man of the moment, a historical figure who appears on the stage of history at the most critical, pivotal hour and, by his will and genius, decisively changes its future course. He was not some ideal, flawless hero from legends, devoid of human weaknesses and vices, but his colossal contribution to to saving Greece from the Persian yoke and to creating the solid foundations for Athens's future greatness and prosperity is absolutely undeniable and recognized by most historians.
His turbulent and dramatic life is an eternal and relevant lesson for all of us about how closely and inextricably genius and cunning, high patriotism and base personal ambitions, resounding triumph and deep personal tragedy are intertwined in real
politics. He somewhat anticipates other complex and brilliant figures in Athenian history, such as Alcibiades, who also combined incredible talents with political unscrupulousness. He vividly demonstrated to the whole world that even a man not of the noblest and wealthiest origins, without the support of powerful aristocratic clans, relying solely on the strength of his own mind, unbending will, and rare gift of persuasion, can reach the most dizzying heights of power and radically change the destiny of his people and his state. But his tragic fate also showed how easily and quickly everything gained, power, fame, and the respect of fellow citizens, can be lost if one fails to stop in time, overestimates one's strength, or becomes too strong, too influential, and therefore too dangerous for the very political system that one once helped to create and strengthen. The democracy that allowed him to rise also brought him down. The story of Themistocles forces us to reflect deeply on the very nature of power and its corrupting influence, on the true price of fame and recognition, on the unpredictable vicissitudes of human destiny, and on the ingratitude of the crowd. He was and remains one of the most fascinating figures of the ancient world, captivating in his complexity and ambiguity, whose great deeds and extraordinary personality still, after almost 2,500 years, evoke the liveliest debates, the most contradictory assessments, and the most sincere admiration from all who are interested in the history of ancient Greece. He is an eternal reminder that history is made not by faceless forces, but by living people with all their passions, virtues, and flaws. Thank you for joining us on this long, but I sincerely hope, fascinating and informative journey into the amazing world of ancient Greece and the destiny of one of its greatest sons. The story of Themistocles is just one of many thousands of amazing and instructive pages from our rich past, which help us to better and more deeply understand our present and perhaps even glimpse our future. Subscribe to our channel if you haven't already. Give us a like if you enjoyed this video and learned something new. And be sure to write in the comments which other outstanding historical figures or significant past events you would like to hear about in our future episodes. Until new, exciting meetings on air.